Nothing is known of how the ancient Florentia passed down to the modern Fiorenza, or Firenze, and whether it brought with it from the Romish ages the character of a manufacturing town. We do not even know, in the Hohenstaufen epoch, in what proportion the population were divided into noble and manufacturing classes. The city at that time lay on the northern Nothing is known of how the ancient Florentia passed into the modern Fiorenza, or Firenze, and whether it brought with it from the Romish ages the character of a manufacturing town. We do not even know, in the Hohenstaufen epoch, in what proportion the population were divided into noble and manufacturing classes. The city at that time lay on the northern bank of the Arno, within low surrounding walls, between which and the river there was a broad space. In that direction they soon extended themselves, made bridges across, and established themselves on the other side. The conquest of Fiesole was the first great deed of the Florentine citizens. The Fiesolans were obliged to settle in the valley below. Pisa, nevertheless, which lay towards the west on the sea-coast, was greater and more powerful. Pisa possessed a fleet and harbors. The Florentine trade was dependent on that of Pisa. Florence had nowhere free communication with the sea. Lucca, Pistoia, Arezzo, Siena, nothing but jealous and warlike cities, encircled her with their territories. In them, however, as in Florence, there were houses of powerful nobles, in whose hands lay the sovereign authority. The disputes of these lords severally, and those of the parties into which they were divided, continued in Tuscany so long as the Hohenstaufens ruled the world. Florence belonged to the heritage of the Countess Matilda, to which the Pope laid claim, because the land had been bequeathed to him, and the Emperor, because an imperial fief could not be so disposed of. This dispute furnished strong points of support for the party feeling in Tuscany. A part of the nobles stood up for the rights of the church, the other to defend those of the emperor. The future of the city depended on the issue of the war, which burst forth immediately in deeds of violence to decide the exciting question. When the imperial party were victorious in Italy, their adherents in Florence triumphed also. When the national party gained the upper hand, the party of the Pope conquered in Tuscany also. When the Lombard cities were subdued by Barbarossa, the imperial faction in Florence broke forth and endeavored to drive away the public magistrates who had been strengthened by their adversaries. When the fortune of the emperor afterwards suddenly changed, the power of his enemies in Tuscany also returned. Under the protection of the Pope, the Tuscan cities formed themselves into a confederation, the capital of which was Florence. Such was the condition of things at the beginning of the 13th century, when the name Guelphs and Ghibellines sprang up, and what had been hitherto a spiritless opposition became a contest with well-matured principles. In the year 1215, the Guelphs and Ghibellines in Florence began to make war on each other. In the year 1321, Dante died. The century between the two dates forms the contents of his poem, the verses of which just as naturally suit the heroic epoch which they depict, as the pure language of Homer does the deeds of the Hellenists before Ilion. Registers of the families as they stood on this side or on that are preserved. We know the position of their palaces, little castles constructed for defense from storm and siege. Registers of the families as they stood on this or that. Registers of the families, as they stood on this side or on that, are preserved. We know the position of their palaces, little castles constructed for defense from storm and siege. We follow from year to year the calamitous circumstances. Old and famous houses decline. New ones rise from small beginnings to power and importance. Continually in the midst of the internal discord, wars occur with the neighbors, with Pisa first, who had command over the way to the sea, with Siena and Pistoia, soon with the entire neighborhood. In the moment of danger, reconciliation, armistice, or treaty unite the contending parties to common force against the enemies of the country. After the victory, however, the old dispute awakens to new evil within their own walls. For the most part, the cause for the state of things abroad lay in those at home. The Guelphs of Florence, when they had the management of things in their hands, urged for war against the Ghibellines of Pisa or Pistoia. The Florentine Ghibellines refused to take the field with them against their own party. Thus Tuscany stood in flames which were not to be extinguished. For if one party succeeded in driving the other out of the city, the banished ones lay without, in their castles, close at the very gate, awaiting the favorable moment for return. To be beaten was not to be overcome. In the worst emergency, supplies and money came from afar. The emperor himself sent German knights to the assistance of the oppressed Ghibellines. To the manufacturing citizens. To the manufacturing citizens, however, this situation of the great nobles was of essential service. The prosperous merchants formed a third element which exerted a powerful influence in the contests of the nobles and forced them to concessions. The city authorities grew strong in the midst of the calamitous disorders. Florence increased in extent and population. In the year 1252, Pisa was already not half so important. A commercial treaty with the Pisans was concluded. They adopted the Florentine weights and measures. It was about this time that Manfred, the last Hohenstaufen king of Naples, supported the Ghibellines alone in Tuscany, when for the last time he sent assistance, his 800 knights, for the most part Germans, united with the Ghibellines of Florence, Siena, Pisa, Prato, Arezzo, and Pistoia, formed a body of 3,000 armed men. The Guelphs were defeated and evacuated the land. Soon, however, after the fall of Manfred, they again attacked Florence, which was now abandoned by the Ghibellines. Charles of Anjou, the new French king of Naples, undertook the protection of the city, and the citizens adopted a new constitution, the foundation of their subsequent independence. Whether the nobles concluded a peace or entered into dispute afresh, it was always a signal to the citizens to make a new attempt to extend their rights, to make their rights, however, a still surer possession. To make their rights, however, a still surer possession, they endeavored to destroy and to purchase the castles of the nobles outside the town and to drive them back by the prohibition of a wide circuit of the city. In Florence herself, the dangerous towers were pulled down which had once been their watchposts, and from whence they had hurled their darts. Too late, the great nobles perceived the consequences of their furious self-destruction. The Ghibellines were crushed, but the victorious Guelphic nobility stood enfeebled before a body of proud citizens, whose rich families maintained themselves as bravely as the nobles. New constitutions gave greater and greater scope to the guilds, which were beginning to form, and at length the intention of admitting those alone to a share in the state who were members of these guilds. New constitutions gave greater and greater scope to the guilds which were beginning to form, and at length the intention of admitting those alone to a share in the state who were members of these guilds stood forth as the aim of this powerful democracy. The old nobility were obliged to allow themselves to be admitted or to be completely excluded. All this, however, proceeded slowly. Great commotions were brought about step by step. There were epochs of rest, happier times, in which the parties joined for peaceful social life. Such a calm occurred in the last decade of the 13th century, when, with the decline of the Hohenstaufens, the idea of the old empire began to dissolve, and the new basis of European political life filled all minds. The divided people were now from henceforth to follow their own way. The jurisdiction of the old Roman Byzantine power was then for the first time broken through. National consciousness penetrated art and literature and revealed itself in new forms. These are the times in which occurred Dante's birth and youth. Florence extended her walls for the third time, Arnolfo di Lapo, the famous architect, began to build the churches which yet stand there as the greatest and finest, and among them most distinguished of all, Santa Maria del Fiore. He built in a new style, the Gothic, or as the Italians called it, the German. The free upward rising proportions of which took the place of the more heavy and wide-spreading dimensions in which they had built hitherto, as the rule of the Hohenstaufens, may be regarded as the final development of the old Roman Empire. So art also appears up to their times as the last fruit of the ideas of the ancients. Dante speaks of the days of his youth as of his lost paradise. But he was not a poet who, absorbed in narrow fancies, had led a secluded life. He was a soldier, statesman, and scholar. He fought in battle, took part in important embassies, and wrote learned and political works. In his youth, a Guelph, he became a furious Ghibelline and wrote and sang for his party, which even still built extravagantly ideal hopes on the advent of a German emperor. Henry of Luxembourg appeared in the year 1311. But to him the old party names had lost their meaning. He saw that Guelphs and Ghibellines alike wished to use him for their own ends, and pursuing likewise the path which seemed to him the most advantageous for his own policy, he adhered to a middle course which led him victoriously on, without giving the advantage to either of the contending parties. Death soon put an end to his efforts, and after he was gone, scarcely a trace of his existence remained behind in the land. His progress through Italy was described by Dino Campagni, a Florentine and friend of Dante. The chronicle of this man, in its simple and beautiful prose, forms a counterpart to Dante's poem, the Symphony of Two Worlds, the ancient and the modern. Fills both their works. They use the language naturally, as the best old authors did theirs, and without abusing its flexibility. Dante speaks of things and feelings plainly, as he sees them and experiences them. When he describes the heaven and the rising and setting of the stars, it is the heaven of Hesiod. If he takes us to the seashore, it seems to be the same shore as that on which Thetis lamented her lost son, or on which the waves had rolled at the feet of Ulysses when he looked out from the island of Calypso, and the sweeping clouds reminded him of the rising smoke of his home. Dante ingeniously compares the scarcely opened, light-dreading eyes of the wandering band of spectres in the lower world with the screwed-up eyes of a tailor who wants to thread his needle. His poem is the fruit of laborious study of the spirit of the Italian language. He must have toiled to catch and to manage its words, like a troop of wild horses which had never gone in harness before. His proud, weighty Italian is a strange contrast to the polished, conventional Latin, in which he wrote more easily. In the latter he is keen, cultivated, and elegant, while his Italian compositions sound as if he had written them half dreaming. In his light verses there lies something of the melancholy to which the sight of nature often disposes us, of that aimless sadness which a cool, glowing sunset in autumn calls forth in us. Dante's fate stands before us like the suffering of an exiled Hellenist who enjoys hospitality at the court of a barbarian prince, whilst hatred and longing gnaw his heart. At times we see more than we have perhaps a right to see, while while contemplating Dante's head, as Giotto has painted it with a few wonderful strokes. On the wall of the chapel of Bargello, his whole life seems to lie in the soft, beautiful features, as if a presentiment of his future overshadowed his youthful brow. Dante died in exile. None of his political ideas were realized. The nations were too deeply involved in their own disorder to have power and enthusiasm left for general European policy. The popes removed to Avignon. Rome stood empty. Italy was left to itself. The 100 years during which this state of things lasted are the second epoch in the development of Florentine liberty, and form at the same time the first era of that unfolding art which finds its great workman in Giotto. We are wont to call Cimabue the founder of modern painting. We are wont to call Cimabue the founder of modern painting. His productions belong to the time in which we are wont to call Cimabue the founder of modern painting. His productions belong to the time in which Dante was born. His works excited astonishment and admiration. Cimabue painted, in the manner of the Byzantine masters, stiff, bulky Madonnas. We would gladly at the present day consider this influence of Byzantine art upon the early Italians. We would gladly at the present day consider this influence of Byzantine art upon the early Italian to have been of the most limited character, and assert rather a native development in direct connection with ancient art. It may have been so with Cimabue, but Giotto, whom he met with on the open field, as a shepherd boy, drawing his cattle on the large flat stones, whom he demanded from his father and took with him to Florence, and instructed, can nevertheless be scarcely designated his disciple. From Cimabue to Giotto there is a steep ascent. Giotto seems alien to his master and almost opposed to him. At the period in which he worked, the intellectual center of Europe was not in Italy. Dante, who had pursued his studies in Paris, freed himself with difficulty from the power of the Latin tongue and the Provençal dialect. It was from France that the new Gothic style came into Italy. It was in France also that Giotto painted. His tender figures, which seem to spring from the most simple examination of nature, still carry with them too much of miniature painting for us entirely to deny the school in which their master learned to draw. It is not easy to gain a clear idea of his work. It embraced the whole range of art. Much of technical rule must have interfered with it, yet he was not devoid of individual power. Dante's portrait, now indeed Giotto's most famous work, retains, even in its present sad condition, something grand and characteristic in the sweep of the lines. The sketch seems to have been produced by a strong hand, which traced with bold strokes what the eye saw and the mind perceived. No artist would have been able to draw with more meaning the rare outline of such a countenance, which, although destroyed, restored, and partly entirely renovated, is imbued with the elevating dignity of him to whom it belonged. The Madonnas which are ascribed to Giotto have an expression of sad loveliness. Heavy, almond-shaped eyes scarcely open, a repetition of the Byzantine type of Madonnas, a sorrowfully smiling mouth, these are their distinctive features. His principal works were not, however, his pictures, with a few insignificant figures, but his fresco paintings, with which he supplied the whole of Italy. Called by the King of Naples to his capital, he painted the churches and palaces there. He executed great works in Lombardy. He was summoned to Rome and Avignon by the popes. Wherever he was required, he was at once ready for service. He worked as painter, sculptor, and architect. He stood on good terms with the nobles, but showed them little deference. His personal characteristics, as depicted by Boccaccio, are not over-idealized. Giotto was small, mean-looking even to ugliness, good-natured but endowed with a sharp tongue. Like all of endless disputes, the intricate nature of which acquired no nobler importance by the presence of distinguished men. His personal characteristics, as depicted by Boccaccio, are not over-idealized. Giotto was small, mean-looking, even to ugliness, good-natured, but endowed with a sharp tongue. Like all Florentines, Dante also could give biting replies. Villani, his contemporary, tells us that he knew how to cut short, with severity, all stupidity and pretension. While, from the impression left by his verses and his sad fate, he should have thought he would have turned away in stately silence, when natures so far below him put his pride to the test. Dante and Giotto remained friends to the end of their lives. When Giotto came through Ferrara on his return from Verona, and Dante heard in Ravenna that he was so near him, he succeeded in having him called to Ravenna. The paintings, however, which he executed in the cathedral there, have perished. Fate was not favorable to his works. In Dante's portrait, a nail has been driven exactly into the eye. Even in the past century, church walls in Naples, which had been painted by Giotto, were whitewashed. A Florentine picture on which Vasari bestows the highest praise was lost from the church to which it belonged during the period that intervened between the first and second editions of his book. It represented the death of Mary, with the apostles standing around, while Christ receives the rising spirit in his arms. Michelangelo is said to have especially liked it. It has never again come to light. The most famous monument, however, which this master has erected to himself, is the bell tower which rises by the side of Santa Maria del Fiore, a slender isolated column of colossal height, quadrangular, and from top to bottom inlaid with marble. As Arnolfo never lived to see the conclusion of his vast cathedral structure, which even a century and a half after his death lacked completion, so was Giotto never permitted to finish his wonderful tower. Like Arnolfo, he left behind a model which they could follow, only that, at the close of the work, they discontinued the Gothic pyramidal spire, because the building was finished at a period when the German style had been long given up and fallen into contempt. As the church next which it stands was to exceed in magnitude any that had ever been built before, Giotto received instructions to erect a tower which should surpass all that Greek and Roman art had produced. The outside, formed of slates of black and white marble, is covered with the most beautiful ornaments and sculpture, which are continued in marvelous abundance to the very top. The construction of the different stories, the windows, the sculpture, wherever the eye rests with attentive observation, all form a matchless whole. Giotto deserved the honor and the remuneration which he obtained for it. The freedom of the city which he received was at that time a great matter, and the yearly allowance of 100 gold florins was no trifling sum. He died in 1336. To the end of the century, his style remained the model for Florentine art. The works of his pupils and imitators present nothing that surpasses him. The age was unproductive, for no higher power asserted itself in Italy than gloomy, contentious selfishness. The land was the theater of endless disputes, the intricate nature of which acquired no nobler importance. He died He died in 1336. To the end of the century, his style remained the model. He died in 1336. To the end of the century, his style remained the model for Florentine art. The works of his pupils and imitators present nothing that surpasses him. The age was unproductive, for no higher power asserted itself in Italy than gloomy, contentious selfishness. The land was the theater of endless disputes. The intricate nature of which acquired no nobler importance by the presence of distinguished men.